Proclaiming Emancipation. Why should we care about format beyond the platitude of book history that size matters? How can we use it as a tool of interpretation? In an online world of scholarship, such as the one we inhabit now when many of our libraries are closed, how can we represent and investigate it? I want to think about forms and how forms and their meanings might shape our understandings of one of the most significant documents in the history of North America, the Emancipation Proclamation. Rightly or wrongly, the Emancipation Proclamation has a place in the cultural consciousness more or less on a level with the nation's founding documents. I'm going to do this with a brief examination of two versions of the proclamation from the University of Pennsylvania's collections. These are in two distinctly different formats. One is a broadside, and the other is a pamphlet. Here are my questions. How do we measure the proclamation's impact by looking at specific instances of it? What were its meanings and for whom? For men in the North who prepared it? For the enslaved Black people who were the object of its rhetoric? To paraphrase Don Mackenzie, can the tools of bibliography help us get to a more precise understanding of the sociology or sociologies of this text? My title, Proclaiming Emancipation, is a nod to the late J. Fliegelman and his book, Declaring Independence. I want to thank Steffi Dippold for her invitation and inspiration to think more about this. Special thanks too to Lynn Farrington, who actually rediscovered the broadsides that I'll show you today, forgotten in a dusty drawer, and researched their authenticity and provenance. And to Mitch Frost and Alexis Newman, who put together a wonderful exhibition on the Emancipation Proclamation several years ago using Penn and Philadelphia collections. The first piece I'm going to talk about is a broadside. The Oxford Companion to the book defines a broadside in this way: a sheet of paper printed on one side only. The broadside is the most primitive and immediate application of the printing press. Any small amount of matter, such as might be wanted on a poster or public notice, could be printed satisfactorily with a minimum of movable type and without the skills required in perfecting a sheet. Because the text of a broadside is usually considered purely ephemeral, its chances of survival are small. Among the earliest broadsides are royal proclamations. Publication had hitherto been achieved viva voce by town criers, but printed copies ensured an accurate publication of the official will in a form that could be consulted when necessary. So the broadside can be a vehicle of cheap print for rapid dissemination, like official information, news, polemics, advertising, and one that can perhaps give us insights into popular culture. Think of the broadside ballad. Modernists might know the broadside as a vehicle for fine press printing or poetry, but broadsides are also still part of popular culture. Think of war and film posters and their visual rhetoric. This particular broadside Emancipation Proclamation is known as the Leland-Bacher autographed or authorized edition, after the two individuals, Charles Godfrey Leland and George H. Bacher, who arranged for its printing and subsequent sale at the Great Central Sanitary Fair in Philadelphia in June 1864. Keep that date in mind. This broadside contains the signatures of Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of State William H. Seward, and Private Secretary to Lincoln John G. Nicolay. Only 48 were made. The idea was to raise funds for the Union war cause by selling them, and those signatures clearly were part of the value. Penn holds three versions of this Leland-Bacher broadside. One is the final version signed by Lincoln. I've already shown you that. The other two are proof copies. And here I'm showing you some details of the earlier of the two proofs at Penn, the second of three proofs that were made. Note the typographical changes that were made from proof to final. The printers chose to reverse the order of the title words, to set a proclamation in a Gothic font and to add a ruled line below it. Why this type choice? Perhaps we can guess that the first version may not have appeared serious enough, and the antique typeface was designed or intended to convey the ancient authority of this new and radical document. Here's my second object, the so-called miniature Emancipation Proclamation. This one is a pamphlet, and I'll turn again to the Oxford Companion to the book, which describes a pamphlet as one or more printed sheets, stabbed or sewn together, containing a single essay, treatise, exposition, or other matter too short to make a book. So we can think of it as a booklet, brief and unbound. These kinds of materials, ephemeral though they are also a key part of the book trade. They're small but powerful. Think of Common Sense or the Communist Manifesto. This piece is tiny, just over 3 inches tall and 2 inches across. Here's where viewing images on the internet can really lead us astray. The scale of what we see on the screen has nothing to do with what printers produced. Here are pictures of me holding each of the two objects, the broadside and the pamphlet, that might help a bit. The pages of the miniature, the pamphlet, were set up for printing on a single small size sheet, which was then folded twice, a quarto. Here's my arts and crafts attempt to represent for you both sides of the sheet as it would have come from the press. The sheets were then folded and trimmed. The pinkish cover would have been printed separately, and we see in the pen copy the stitching attaching cover to text. There seems to be only one real source of information on the production of this artifact, this miniature Emancipation Proclamation, in a collection of the letters and recollections of John Murray Forbes. Forbes was the printer, prepared by his daughter, Sarah Forbes Hughes, and published in Boston in 1899. Here's what Sarah Forbes Hughes writes. With the view of placing the Proclamation of Emancipation in the hands of the Negroes themselves, my father had 1 million copies printed on small slips, 1.5 inches square, put into packages of 50 each, and distributed among the Northern soldiers at the front, who scattered them among the blacks while on the march. Is that story plausible? Here I'm going to cite the Grand Master of 19th century American book history, Michael Winship. Michael thinks it is possible. He tells me that they could have likely have been printed on low-quality paper on a newspaper press. One could print, Michael says, 210, 14 times 15 by 15 of the slips on a single sheet, 1,000 slips on 5 sheets, or 100,000 per ream. Thus, 10 reams required to produce 1 million slips. But Michael also points out that what I am showing you is not what Sarah Forbes Hughes is describing. She writes of a slip. This, though, is a sheet, folded and then stab stitched into the pink cover, something bibliographically very different. Michael's point reminds us to be cautious when we look at the often cited sources and bibliographies of the past. For example, Charles Eberstadt's standard 1950 bibliography of the Emancipation Proclamation describes this object as having been printed in December 1862, and Eberstadt writes with certainty, this is the edition said to have been published by Forbes and distributed by him in 1 million copies to the soldiers and Negroes. Well, maybe it was not this edition. Perhaps the small slip printing that Sarah Forbes Hughes describes did exist, but I've never seen nor heard of a copy. The little miniature booklet that does survive, and that I'm showing you here, was surely produced in large numbers. But was it actually sent with Union soldiers into the South? Historians continue to tell this story, and it's powerful. But is it a myth? I'd say that we still have bibliographical work to do to figure that out. We want to tell stories about these objects, but the stories we tell may actually not represent the objects that we have. So what can we learn from a comparison of these two versions of emancipation? First, we shouldn't forget to read the text. These two are actually different emancipations. The miniature is the preliminary proclamation drafted by Lincoln in September 1862. The broadside is the version publicly announced on January 1st, 1863. There are numerous differences, but among the most significant are the named places in the later public version. Here, the broadside, those places declared to be in rebellion where enslaved people were freed. All areas occupied by Union forces, though, were specifically exempted. To be clear, the miniature says January 1st, 1863, but it was produced before that and contains an earlier text. When readers in 1863 read, saw, or heard the Emancipation Proclamation, what version of the proclamation did they actually experience? We should also be cautious about following some well-worn paths of book history thinking. If we take a kind of standard line, we oppose a kind of printing teleology. The largest, fanciest books and printed products come first. The popular, cheaper, edited, and abridged, more widely distributed versions come after. That does not appear to be what happened here, though. Small and cheap, the booklet or pamphlet came first. Elegant, elite, and collectible, this broadside, came later. We might imagine that the smallest items, like the fragile miniature, must be the rarest, but I don't think that's true in this situation. First, the Leland-Bacher printed broadside is and was always rare on purpose, a very limited edition meant to be signed and sold. It was and has always been a collector's item. The miniature? It might have been a mass-produced piece meant for the widest distribution possible in every Union soldier's pocket. Still, we need to be careful to avoid creating another fantasy around format, since we still know very little about this item's actual circulation. And what about the values that our culture, assigns to them? The prices that copies of the Leland-Bacher broadside fetch in the market today are quite extraordinary, in the 7 figures. We might ask why such value accrues in a document that, yes, signed by Lincoln, was essentially a fundraising souvenir. What if the millions of dollars that this object has generated over time were to go to, say, reparations payments? We might also say that neither of these documents is the Emancipation Proclamation. The medium of the proclamation, at least originally, was the spoken word, the public announcement, the most ephemeral medium of all. Perhaps the proclamation is not a physical document, but an act, a speech act that creates an actual legal change in real people's lives. One reads out the announcement, and then the action that is being announced takes place. In the theory, a printed proclamation is a different kind of publishing, of making public. Both of these printed artifacts are tools not of proclamation, but of dissemination. And what does a proclamation mean if the intended beneficiaries of its words, enslaved Americans, didn't actually hear it? Or if they learned only very belatedly of it, in the now famous story of Juneteenth, in the case of Texas, not until June 19, 1865. If you do not have access to hear or know of a declaration, is it really one to you? And since the proclamation was only addressed to territories that the Union didn't control, it was a proclamation with no practical effect, only a political and rhetorical one, and it didn't grant any enslaved person their freedom. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that the Proclamation of Emancipation was empty of force and had no impact on anyone. As John Hope Franklin outlines in a beautiful essay on the National Archives website, many groups in the North, including African American communities, learned of it quickly and reacted with great emotion. There were those in favor and those against it. But perhaps to understand how proclaiming really worked during those crucial days and months, we need to use the tools of bibliography and to think, as Don McKenzie so powerfully argues, about the sociology of the texts that we are investigating. Proclaiming a thing is not performing it. Claims and statements, even official edicts, do not in and of themselves do the work of according civil rights, of protecting and ensuring freedom, equal opportunity, racial fairness, justice. We have work to do to understand these documents, just as now we still have work to do as a nation. Thank you.